It begins with a single man walking alone under a sky filled with silent stars. No army, no kingdom, no wealth, just a question burning in his heart. Who is the one behind all of this? That man was Abraham, or as he is known in Islam, Ibrahim. A name that echoes across deserts, scriptures, and centuries. A man claimed by three of the world's greatest religions. A man whose story was told and retold in three different ways. But how can one life lead to three different narratives? What changed? What was preserved? And what was rewritten? Tonight we step into a journey that crosses time, faith, and identity. A journey into the life of one man, seen through three different lenses, and what we find may change everything you thought you knew. The desert wind whispers his story long before books were written. A child is born into a world of idols. Stone figures carved by human hands worshipped as gods. In Islamic tradition, Ibrahim grows up in a society where people bow to statues, to stars, to the sun. But even as a young boy, something feels wrong. The silence of idols disturbs him. Their helplessness confuses him. He begins to question. He looks at the stars. "This is my Lord," he says. But then the stars disappear. "I do not like those that set." He turns to the moon, then to the sun. Each one rises, shines, and fades. And with each setting, a realization grows stronger. The true God cannot disappear, cannot fade, cannot depend on time. And in that moment, a revolutionary idea is born. There is only one God. Absolute. In Islam, this moment is not just discovery, it is awakening. A rejection of everything society taught him, a rebellion not of violence, but of truth. In the Jewish tradition, Abraham, known as Abraham, is also a man chosen by God. But the emphasis shifts. Here, the focus is not just on discovering God, but on a covenant, a promise. God speaks to Abraham, "Leave your land, your people, your father's house, and go to the land I will show you." This is not just a spiritual journey. It is a physical migration, a test of trust. And Abraham obeys. Without knowing the destination, without seeing the future, he walks into the unknown, guided only by faith. In this version, Abraham becomes the father of a nation, a lineage that will grow into the children of Israel, a people chosen to carry a divine mission. The story is not just about one man, it is about a legacy, a promise that echoes through generations. In Christianity, Abraham stands as a symbol of faith itself. The Apostle Paul later writes of him as the ultimate example of belief, a man justified not by law but by faith. Here, Abraham's story becomes universal, not limited to a single nation, but expanded to all who believe. His journey becomes a blueprint. Trust in God even when it doesn't make sense. Believe even when the path is unclear. And in this narrative, Abraham is not just a historical figure. He becomes a spiritual ancestor, a father of faith for all believers. But as we look closer, a question begins to rise. If this is the same man, why do the stories begin to diverge? One of the most powerful moments in Abraham's life is the test, a command that shakes the soul, a father told to sacrifice his son. In the biblical narrative, the son is Isaac, the long-awaited child of promise, born to Sarah in her old age. The miracle child, God commands Abraham to take Isaac to a mountain and offer him as a sacrifice. It is a test of obedience beyond comprehension, and Abraham prepares to do it. But at the last moment, God stops him. A ram is provided instead. The sacrifice is not completed, and Abraham passes the test. In Islamic tradition, the story is similar. But one detail changes everything. The son is not named directly in the Quran, but the context strongly points to Ishmael, the firstborn, the son of Hajar. In this version, Abraham sees a dream, a vision of himself sacrificing his son, and he shares it. "My son, I have seen in a dream that I must sacrifice you. What do you think?" And the son replies, "O my father, do what you are commanded. You will find me, if Allah wills, among the patient." This is not just obedience, it is submission from both father and son, a shared act of faith. And just like in the biblical story, the sacrifice is stopped, a ram is sent, and the test becomes a symbol of ultimate trust in God. But now the divide becomes clear. Isaac or Ishmael. Two lineages, two interpretations. In Judaism and Christianity, Isaac is the chosen son, the carrier of the covenant, the continuation of the promise. But in Islam, Ishmael is not forgotten. He is honored. He is part of the divine plan. He becomes the ancestor of the Arab people, and through him the lineage that leads to Prophet Muhammad. This is where history, identity, and belief begin to intertwine. Not just theology, but legacy. Another moment reveals deeper differences, the building of a sacred house. In Islamic tradition, Ibrahim and Ishmael build the Kaaba, a simple structure in the barren desert of Mecca, a house dedicated to the worship of one God, a place that will become the center of Islamic worship. Millions will turn toward it 5 times a day and every year. Pilgrims will walk in the footsteps of Ibrahim, reliving his journey, his sacrifice. This moment does not exist in the same way in the Bible. There is no Kaaba, no Mecca. The geography shifts. The focus remains on the land of Canaan, the promised land, the center of the covenant, different locations, different symbols, but the same man at the center. And then there is Hajar or Hagar, a woman whose story is often overlooked. In the biblical account, Hagar is the servant of Sarah. She bears Abraham's first son, Ishmael. But tensions rise, and she is sent away into the wilderness, alone with her child. In Islamic tradition, her story becomes one of resilience, of survival. Left in the desert with no water, her desperation grows. She runs between 2 hills searching for help 7 times until finally, a miracle. Water springs from the ground, the well of Zamzam, a source that still flows today. Her struggle becomes part of a sacred ritual. Pilgrims reenact her search. Her pain becomes history. Her faith becomes legacy. In the Bible, her story is shorter, more distant, less central. But in Islam, she is, remember, honored. Her struggle is not forgotten as we piece together these narratives. A pattern begins to emerge. Each religion holds on to Abraham, but shapes his story to reflect its message. In Judaism, he is the father of a chosen nation. In Christianity, he is the model of faith for all believers. In Islam, he is a prophet of pure monotheism, a man who submitted completely to God. Three perspectives, three emphases, one life. But beneath the differences, there is something deeper, a shared foundation. All three agree. Abraham rejected idolatry. All three agree he followed one God. All three agree he was tested and he remained faithful. These are not small details. They're the core of his identity. So why the differences? Some say history shaped the narratives. Others say interpretation evolved over time. And some believe each version preserves a part of a larger truth, a truth that cannot be fully contained in one perspective. Imagine the desert again, the same man standing under the same sky, but three observers, each watching from a different angle, each recording what they see, each telling the story in their own way. The result, three stories, not entirely different, but not identical either. And perhaps the real mystery is not which story is right, but what they all point toward. A man who walked away from everything familiar, who trusted the unseen, who stood firm when tested beyond human limits. A man who chose God over comfort, over certainty, over fear. Today, billions of people trace their spiritual heritage back to him. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all call him Father. But do they truly understand him? Or have the stories become walls instead of bridges? Because if one man can unite three religions, then why do his followers remain divided? Why does the legacy of Abraham lead to conflict instead of connection? Perhaps the answer lies not in the differences, but in the common ground, the courage to question, the willingness to believe, the strength to submit to truth. These are not owned by any one religion. They are human, universal, timeless, and maybe, just maybe, Abraham's true story is not about choosing between Isaac or Ishmael, not about land or lineage, but about something deeper, a call to rise above division, to seek truth even when it challenges everything, to trust even when the path is unclear. The desert is still there, the stars still shine, and the question that Abraham asked still echoes today: who is the one behind all of this? Three religions, three stories, one man, but perhaps one message. And as history continues to unfold, his legacy remains unfinished, not written in books alone, but in the choices of those who claim to follow him, because in the end, the story of Abraham is not just about the past, it is about us and whether we choose division or the unity hidden within his story. And yet the deeper we go into his story, the more the silence between the lines begins to speak. Because Abraham's life was not just a series of events, it was a transformation, a breaking and a rebuilding, a journey from certainty into the unknown. Imagine the moment he leaves his homeland. No map, no destination, no guarantee of return, just a command. A voice calling him forward. In every tradition, this moment exists, but its weight is often overlooked. To leave everything behind is not just movement, it is surrender. It is the death of the old self and the birth of something entirely new. In Islam, Ibrahim is called Khalilullah, the friend of God, not a servant alone, but a friend, a title that suggests closeness, intimacy, trust. But friendship with God is not easy. It comes with tests, with sacrifice, with moments that break the heart. In the biblical tradition, Abraham's faith is described as righteousness. He believes, and it is counted to him as righteousness. But belief here is not passive. It is active. It is walking when the road disappears beneath your feet. It is trusting when logic fails. And in both traditions, there is a pattern. Every blessing is followed by a test. Every promise by a trial. Years past, decades, and still no child. A promise was made. A great nation would come from him. But time keeps moving, and the promise seems delayed. Doubt begins to whisper. Questions begin to rise. Was the promise real? Was it misunderstood, or was it a test all along? In the biblical account, Sarah suggests a solution. Hagar, a servant, through her Abraham has a son. Ishmael, a child born not just from desire, but from impatience, from human reasoning trying to fulfill a divine promise. But then, years later, the impossible happens. Sarah gives birth, Isaac, a miracle child born when hope had already faded, a reminder that divine promises do not follow human timelines. Now the tension grows. Two sons, two mothers, two futures. And the household becomes divided. In one narrative, Ishmael and Hagar are sent away. In another, they are placed in the desert by divine command. But in both, there is separation, a painful distance, a moment where love and obedience collide. Think about it. A father watching his child walk into the wilderness, knowing he may never see him again. This is not just history. This is heartbreak. But even in separation, there is care. In the biblical account, God hears the cry of Ishmael. He is not abandoned. He is seen. In the Islamic tradition, the desert becomes the beginning of a new legacy. Not an end, but a beginning. Two sons, not one rejected and one accepted, but two paths unfolding, two destinies written side by side. And this is where the narrative becomes deeper than identity, because both traditions agree God was present in both lives, not just one. So why do we focus on division? Why do we reduce the story to a choice? Isaac or Ishmael? Chosen or not chosen, when the reality is more complex, more human, and more divine. Perhaps the real story is not about exclusion, but expansion, not about one being erased, but both being part of a greater design. As time moves forward, the descendants of these two sons grow. Nations rise. Cultures form. Religions take shape. And slowly, the story of one family becomes the story of humanity. But with growth comes distance, and with distance comes misunderstanding. Centuries pass, texts are written, interpretations are formed, and what was once a shared story begins to split. Each community holds on to its version, protects it, defends it, sometimes at the cost of the others. And yet, if Abraham were to stand among us today, what would he recognize? The faith or the division? Would he see unity in the belief of one God? Or would he see lines drawn between brothers Because the man who broke idols, would he accept the new idols we have created? Not of stone, but of identity, of pride, of us and them. The irony is powerful. A man who stood alone against his entire society has become the center of three societies that stand apart from each other. But maybe, just maybe, the answer has been there all along. In every version of his story, there is a moment of surrender, a moment where Abraham lets go, of understanding, of everything. When he leaves his home, he surrenders. When he waits for a child, he surrenders. When he prepares to sacrifice his son, he surrenders. This is the thread that connects all three narratives, not the details, not the names, but the surrender. In Islam, the very word Islam means submission. In Christianity, faith is trust in God's will. In Judaism, obedience to God's covenant is central, different words, but the same essence. And perhaps that's the point, not to argue over the branches, but to understand the root. Because the root is not Isaac, the root is not Ishmael, the root is not land or lineage. The root is surrender to the one who created it all. The desert returns, the stars above unchanged, and Abraham stands there once more, not as a figure of division, but as a symbol of something greater, a man who searched for truth and was willing to pay any price to find it. And now the question is no longer about him. It is about us. Will we inherit his faith or just his story? Will we carry forward his courage or only his name? Because in the end, history does not divide us. We divide ourselves. Abraham's journey was never meant to create walls. It was meant to open a path toward the one, a path beyond labels, beyond differences, beyond everything that separates us. Three religions, still looking back at the same man, still telling his story, still claiming his legacy. But maybe the real legacy of Abraham is not in how we remember him, but in how we follow him, because the story is not finished. It is still being written in hearts and choices, in the quiet moments where faith is tested, and somewhere in the silence of the night, under the same endless sky. The question still remains, not which story is true, but whether we have understood the man behind them. One man. Three stories, one truth waiting to be seen, and the closer you look, the clearer it becomes that Abraham was never meant to divide the world. He was sent to remind it that there is only one. And still, there is one more layer to this story, a layer that history rarely speaks about, not written clearly in Scripture, but felt in its shadows, a question that lingers long after the words are read. What did Abraham feel? We are told what he did. We are told what he said. We are told the commands he followed. But what about the silence between those moments? The nights when no voice came, the hours when doubt crept in, the weight of decisions that no human should ever have to make. Because to understand Abraham is not just to study his actions, it is to step into his humanity. A man chosen by God, yet still a man, a heart that loved, a soul that feared, a mind that wondered. Imagine the night before the sacrifice, whichever son you believe it was, the reality remains the same. A father standing at the edge of the unimaginable, looking at his child, not as a symbol, not as a narrative, but as his son, his flesh, his love. Did his hands tremble? Did his heart race? Did he ask, why me? Scripture does not tell us, but silence often speaks louder than words, because true faith is not the absence of fear, it is moving forward despite it. And this is what makes Abraham's story so powerful. Not just that he obeyed, but that he chose obedience in the face of everything human within him. This is not blind faith, this is conscious surrender, a decision made at the highest cost. And perhaps this is why his story echoes across religions, because it touches something universal, the struggle between what we want and what we believe is right, between attachment and truth. But here is where the story turns again. Because after the test, after the sacrifice is stopped, after the moment passes, life continues. And this is something we often forget. The test ends, but the consequences remain. A father still remembers that moment. A son still carries that experience. A family still lives with the echoes of what almost happened. Faith is not just built in moments of testing. It is carried in the days that follow. And Abraham continues not as a man who passed one test, but as someone who will face many more. He buries loved ones. He ages. He watches generations grow, and slowly he becomes something more than a man. He becomes a memory, a story, a symbol. And symbols are powerful, but they are also dangerous because over time they lose their humanity. Aaron becomes the father of nations, the model of faith, the friend of God, titles that elevate him, but also distance him, because the more we turn him into a symbol, the less we see the man. And when we lose the man, we lose the connection, because the real power of his story is not that he was perfect. It is that he struggled and still chose God. This is what unites all three traditions. Even if the details differ, the essence remains a man who searched, a man who questioned, a man who surrendered. But somewhere along the way, we stopped focusing on his journey and started focusing on ownership. Whose Abraham is he? Which version is correct? Which lineage matters more? Questions that pull us further apart from the very message he lived. Because Abraham did not belong to a religion. Religion came after him. He did not carry labels. He carried truth. And truth is not divided. It is we who divide it through interpretation, through identity, through the need to be right instead of being sincere. But imagine for a moment if we stripped everything back. No labels, no debates, no inherited narratives, just a man standing under the stars asking a question and finding an answer that changed everything. Would we still argue? Or would we recognize something familiar? Because deep down, every human being asks the same question in different ways, at different times. But the same question nonetheless. Why am I here? Who created this? What is the truth? Abraham's story is not unique because of what happened to him. It is unique because of how he responded. He did not ignore the question. He followed it all the way to its end. And that is what makes him timeless. Not the details of his life, but the direction of his heart. So maybe the real question is not which version of Abraham is true, but which part of Abraham lives in us. Do we question or do we follow blindly? Do we seek truth or defend tradition? Do we surrender or hold on to control? Because in the end, the story was never meant to stay in the past. It was meant to continue through every person who dares to search, to question, to believe. And maybe that is the final piece of the puzzle. Abraham was not the end of the story. He was the beginning, a beginning that led to prophets, to scriptures, to civilizations, but also to divisions. And now the responsibility shifts from him to us, because we are the ones telling his story now. We are the ones shaping how he is remembered. We are the ones deciding whether his legacy becomes a bridge or a barrier. Three religions, still connected to one man, still standing at a crossroads. And the choice remains the same: unity or division, truth or pride. Because the story of Abraham is no longer just about what happened. It is about what happens next, and somewhere beyond the izudizin, beyond everything that separates us, there is still a path, the same path Abraham once walked, a path toward the one. And the question is, will we follow it? Or will we remain standing, arguing over the footprints he left behind? Because time moves forward, generations pass, but truth does not change. One man, three stories, one legacy still unfolding. And in the end, it will not be history that defines Abraham. It will be what we chose to learn from him. And now we arrive at the part of the story that few dare to confront. Not the past, but the consequences of it. Because Abraham's story did not end with him and move forward. Through bloodlines, beliefs, and borders, it shaped civilizations, it defined identities. And over time, it became something far greater than one man ever imagined. Look at the world today, nations built on his legacy, peoples who trace their origins back to his sons, prayers that still carry his name, rituals that still echo his actions. And yet, a world that remains divided, the children of Abraham, standing on different sides of history, sometimes in peace, often in tension, and at times in conflict. This is the reality we cannot ignore. A man who called humanity to one God became the center of three paths that rarely meet. But is that truly his legacy, or is it ours? Because if we look closely, the division does not come from Abraham. It comes from what came after: interpretations, politics, power, human desires layered onto divine messages. Over centuries, the story was not just preserved, it was shaped, expanded, defended, and sometimes used to justify identity, used to claim superiority, used to draw lines where none originally existed. And slowly, the simplicity of Abraham's message became surrounded by complexity. But strip everything away, and what remains? A man who stood against falsehood, a man who chose truth over tradition, a man who surrendered completely to the one. No politics, no borders, no divisions, just truth. So how did we move so far from that? Perhaps the answer lies in a simple human tendency, the need to belong, to define ours and them, to protect what we believe is ours. And in doing so, we forget that truth is not owned, it is followed. Abraham did not create a group, he responded to a calling. He did not build walls, he broke them. But over time, walls were rebuilt stronger, higher, more difficult to cross, and we stand on either side of them looking at the same man, but seeing different things. One sees a father of a nation, another sees a symbol of faith, another sees a prophet of submission, different reflections of the same reality. But what if the reflections are not the problem? What if the problem is that we stop looking beyond them? Because reflections can differ, but the source remains the same. And Abraham was pointing to the source, not to himself, not to his lineage, but to the one beyond all of it. And maybe that is what we have forgotten. We turn the journey into an identity, the message into a label, the truth into something to defend instead of something to live. But truth does not need defense. It needs sincerity. And sincerity is what defined Abraham. He did not follow truth because it was easy. He followed it because it was real. Even when it meant standing alone. Even when it meant losing everything. Even when it meant facing the unimaginable. This is the part of his story that unites all three religions, but is often the least practiced, because it is easier to inherit belief than to live it. Easier to claim identity than to question ourselves. Easier to argue over history than to reflect on what it demands from us today. But Abraham's story was never meant to be easy. It was meant to challenge, to awaken, to push us beyond comfort. And that is why it still matters. Because the world today is not so different from his time. People still worship things other than God, not statues of stone, but idols of wealth, of power, of ego. And the question still remains the same. Will we recognize the truth or ignore it? Will we break the idols or bow to them? This is the real continuation of Abraham's story, not in books, not in debates, but in the choices we make every day. Because every generation faces its own test, and every individual has their own moment of decision to follow truth or to follow comfort, to stand firm or to blend in, to surrender or to control. And in those moments, we are closer to Abraham than we realize, not through lineage, but through choice. Because being connected to Abraham is not about who we are born as. It is about what we choose to become. A seeker of truth, a believer in the unseen, a servant of the one, or something else. And this is where the story becomes personal, because it is no longer about him. It is about you, about the questions you avoid, the truths you hesitate to accept, the faith you struggle to hold on to, because Abraham struggled too. He questioned, he searched, he waited, and in the end, he found something worth surrendering everything for. So the question is no longer which version of his story is correct. The question is, what will you do with it? Will you use it to divide, to argue, to claim superiority, or will you let it transform you? Will you let it challenge your assumptions, your identity, Your comfort, because that is what his story was always meant to do, not to be admired from a distance, but to be lived, and maybe that is the final truth hidden within all three narratives, that Abraham's greatest legacy is not in the differences we debate, but in the example he set, an example that does not belong to one religion, but speaks to all, a call to rise above division, to seek truth sincerely, to submit to the one completely. And now, the story reaches its final moment, not in history, but in the present, because the desert is still there, the sky is still vast, and the silence still asks the same question: who will follow the path of Abraham? Not in name, but in truth. Because one man, three stories have led us here to a moment of choice. And whatever we choose next will decide whether his legacy becomes a light or remains a shadow divided across the world. The story ends, but the journey does not, because the footsteps of Abraham are still there, waiting, and only those who truly seek will have the courage to follow them.